Americans feel some ownership of the Good Friday Agreement. President Clinton leaned in. I was actually here in Washington at the time, and it was very difficult when they first leaned in with Gerry Adams's visa. But since then, we got the Good Friday Agreement, we got the talks.
Meanwhile, the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party is setting up a panel to analyse Rishi Sunak's new Brexit deal with the European Union. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 17 points at 79.29. The pound buys $1.20 and €1.12. LBC weather, spells of rain turning to sleet and snow in places in the south tonight. A low of -5 in northern Scotland. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening. It's 2 minutes past 8 on LBC. Welcome to Monday's Cross Question. On the panel tonight, to my left, Baroness Jenny Jones, Green Party peer, former Deputy Mayor of London, a good friend of the programme, multi-appearances on Cross Question, haven't you, Jenny? You're a veteran almost.
A veteran.
George Freeman, though, are you making your debut tonight?
Debut on Cross Question?
I think you are. Conservative MP for Mid-Norfolk and the Science Research and Innovation Minister. His department made a big announcement today, but it may have been eclipsed by someone called Sue Gray. We'll ask him about that a little bit later. Sebastian Payne, on my right here, is director of the Onward think tank, formerly with the Financial Times, of course, and best-selling author. Marina Purkiss is a political commentator and co-host of the podcast The Trawl, which you can find on Global Player, and we'll hear a little bit about that in just a few minutes' time. Now, if you'd like to ask a question, you can do so by phoning us on 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850, or you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC, and of course, don't forget, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first question. It's from Robbie in Chelmsford. Hi, Robbie.
Evening.
What would you like to ask?
So my question is, who would you most trust to uphold standards in public life? Sue Gray or the Parliamentary Conservative Party?
Well, let's ask a member of the Parliamentary Conservative Party, George Freeman. I imagine you were probably expecting a question along those lines. What's your answer?
Well, the honest answer is both. The maintenance of standards requires really good process, really good officials. And Sue Gray, in my experience, she's been very diligent, very professional, and in 12 years in and out of government, all the officials I've worked with have been at pains to make sure that due process is properly followed. But you also need a political class. You need a parliament of all parties who take those standards very seriously. So my honest answer is both. And I'm a bit surprised, if I'm honest, that Sue, who's been the great upholder of standards and done a very diligent job, has inadvertently or however, it's a slightly unfortunate situation, because I think by accepting and by allowing this to be rolled out that she's joining the Labour Party so quickly after leading the investigation, independent of investigation into Boris Johnson, I think it brings the process slightly into doubt. I mean, I think she's been a first-class leader in terms of standards, but it's unfortunate that the whole process is now being brought into question.
But can you understand why Keir Starmer would want her in that position? Because she is somebody who knows how the levers of government work, and that part of the role, I think, of Chief of Staff in Number 10 is to progress chase, and she would know how to do that better than anyone.
Oh, I totally understand why Keir Starmer would want her. But I think the issue is, when did the conversations begin? At what point? When are the disclosures? There are very strict rules about, under ACOBA, the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments. They apply to senior civil servants as well as ministers. You have to get permission. And I just think it's slightly unfortunate. And I think Sue Gray is an excellent public servant. The issue is process, I think. And I asked the Labour Party to just come out and be a bit more transparent about how long these conversations have been going on, and try and uphold that process, because it is in the end the process that's our best protector.
Did you have these same concerns when David Frost joined the government from being a civil servant?
Yes, I've always had these concerns, and I've had concerns about, the ministerial code, which I value very, very highly. It doesn't just say that you can't actively pursue anything that is a conflict of interest, but you must avoid creating the perception of any conflict of interest. And I'm just surprised that Keir Starmer and Sue Gray have allowed us to get to a situation where that is exactly what's happening. It's unfortunate, but I think Sue Gray has been a first-class official, and I can see exactly why Keir Starmer would want her, but process is key.
Because it is ironic, isn't it, that some of the very people who were praising Sue Gray's independence to the skies during the Partygate inquiry, like Nadine Dorries, like Jacob Rees-Mogg, have now turned turtle.
Yeah, you can't have it both ways, really. I mean, you know, I think, as I said, that standards in public life require two things: a clear code and a process by which they're enforced, but also requires political class to take them seriously. And in all my ministerial roles, I found my private office and the officials have been very diligent and very careful and very supportive, as Sue has always been. So I don't have a problem at all with Sue Gray's independence. I just think it's an unfortunate process that we're now sort of calling that into judgment because she's taken, or seemingly taken, I'm not quite sure, and I'd love the Labour Party to make clear whether she's accepted a role, been offered a role, whether she's discussed it with a COBRA. It's an unfortunate situation.
We were supposed to have a Labour MP on tonight, but unfortunately they couldn't make it. But we're delighted that Jenny stepped in at the last minute. Now, you don't have a dog in this race, so to speak, because you're not from the Labour or Conservative parties. Looking at this as a politician from a different party, where do you fall down on this question?
Well, it's quite an interesting question from Robbie, and I'd be interested in his answer as well, because I suspect I know. Quite honestly, I wouldn't trust this Conservative government to feed my cat. If I had a cat, I haven't got a cat. Now, George here seems a very nice man, and perhaps he would feed my cat if I had one.
I'd be
very
delighted
nicely.
to feed your cat, Jenny. Just give me the postcode.
The Conservative government is going to this hissy fit. I don't know anything about the process. It does sound as if it was perhaps a bit short-circuited. I've got no idea. But the fact that the Conservatives are going into this terrible state about losing Sue Gray suggests that they've got no self-awareness. I mean, if you think about all the scandals that have been going on over the past 13 years, and some of them we're only hearing about now. So, no, I would not trust the Conservative government to maintain any sort of standards except the lowest.
Why do you think Keir Starmer, with Nick Ferrari this morning, was so reluctant to say when he first started having discussions with Sue Gray?
I didn't hear that interview. He's a very cautious person. I mean, if I had a complaint about Keir Starmer as a Labour leader, I would say he doesn't have enough sort of chutzpah. He doesn't, step out in front. So he's very cautious. He's a lawyer, and I have no idea why he wouldn't be straight, because it is in his best interest to be so.
Marina Purkiss.
I think what we're seeing here is the Tory party trying to rewrite history. Because let's say, for example, that, let's play the game. Sue Gray is at heart a Labour supporter. What does that mean regarding her report? Because at the end of the day, it was the Met Police that fined Boris Johnson. It's not like she was the reason for his downfall. In fact, the reason for his downfall was completely different. It was about Chris Pincher, I believe his name was, and the fact that he appointed him after knowing what he did. That's what caused the unravelling. That's what caused the loss of public support, the loss of his own party support, a mutiny within his own party. And yet we've got people now trying to rewrite history and say this is down to Sue Gray. It wasn't Sue Gray that found him guilty and fined him. It was the Met Police.
I didn't suggest that, just for the record.
Not you, but there is a group of people, of Boris Johnson, fanboys, fangirls, and people within the party.
I think we should also say that civil servants, by their very job, are interested in politics. So it's not a surprise if individual civil servants, whether they're junior or senior, have their own political views. But it's very rare that they ever either express them or people know what those views are. So doesn't bother me at all. I mean, as somebody who people will see as a vague supporter of the government, if Sue Gray had got Labour views, I don't think, as a director of ethics and integrity in the Cabinet Office, there wasn't a single occasion, I think, when her integrity was called into question, and I don't think anybody called it into question during the course of that of the inquiry into Partygate. Now, Seb, you were covering that as a journalist for the FT. Would you agree with what I just said?
I think Sue Gray is a fascinating character and has created a mystique around herself. And when she was Director of Propriety and Ethics, she was known for urging double deletion of emails and was known as someone who liked to cover up her tracks and was involved in the quite dubious clearinghouse for freedom of information requests within the Cabinet Office. So, during Partygate, you're right, there were many people who tried to paint her as this whiter-than-white personality. I think that's absolutely not the case. And when I was at the FT, in the book I wrote about Boris Johnson, highlighted the kind of controversial nature of her backdrop. But just on this particular issue here, first of all, you mentioned Lord David Frost, Ian, who's someone who was a civil servant, who went to eventually become a special advisor, and then appear. There was a 3-year gap between Lord Frost leaving the civil service before he came back as a political appointee. In those 3 years, there was not privileged information that he would have had that would have been relevant to the government. And I think that's the question at the heart of this here, because Sue Gray's not just second permanent secretary at the Levelling Up Department. As you said, she was in charge of the most sensitive discussions around government. And to give you an example of just how senior and influential Sue Gray is across Whitehall, she was at the Queen's funeral sitting between Sir Graham Brady and a cabinet minister. There's not many permanent secretaries who get positions at a royal funeral, showing just how big and influential she was. I think the question is going to be somewhat what George was talking about earlier, about when this all started to happen, because this thing called a COBA that does business appointments for when people leave government. First of all, you
chaired by a Conservative peer.
Chaired by Lord Pickles, Conservative peer, was appointed by this government. But the point is, you go to a COBA and you say, I'm considering taking up this role. They will then go away and give advice on when you can do it. That didn't happen. This appointment was announced before Sue Gray approached a COBA, and she will be aware that a COBA is a little bit toothless in these things.
But to be fair to her, I suspect that happened because there was a leak. And it got into the papers, and so she had to act quite quickly. Otherwise, it would have become all very messy. Now, you can argue, well, it has become messy anyway, but I think that was the sequence of events, wasn't it?
For sure, but then there is this other question as well, that civil service has quite clear rules about when you do and don't speak to opposition politicians. Now, in the run-up to a general election, senior civil servants will go and speak to their opponents, licensed by the Cabinet Secretary, to talk about if they win the election. So, come the next election, I imagine that would happen with Labour, that Simon Case and other people will go and talk to people in Labour and say, well, if you win the election, what would you do? For that to happen outside an election cycle, which it has, there's no doubt about that, that is quite unusual. So I think really, if Labour wants to stop the whole row about this, it needs to come out and answer these questions pretty quickly about process.
I just need to ask though, which bit of Sue Gray's report are you pointing to and going, that's because she had in her heart Labour? Because that's not clear to me.
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking entirely about civil service.
This is what we're positioning. So let's focus on this issue. This is what people are saying. We're saying that.
Well, there's a few Boris Johnson supporters are saying
it's
that.
Not what I'm saying.
Okay,
it's not what Seb's saying.
But what we're saying. So which part of the report goes? Aha. That's her Labour coming through.
Well, I'm not saying that. George is not saying that. I'm talking.
This is the discussion. This is what we're saying.
Well, you're wanting to have a discussion, but we're making a different point, answering Robbie's question, which is how do we maintain standards?
Okay, fine.
I mean, the point is, it comes down to this. Does anyone believe that when Sue Gray is sat round with the shadow cabinet and somebody pipes up and says, well, Sue, what was discussed in that particular meeting? Do we believe that Sue Gray is going to tell them what was discussed in that meeting or not? I would submit not.
But that is true, Ian, and she will have, when a COBA does rule on this, it will set out some restrictions about what she can or can't say. One interesting question will be the length of time before she can take up the appointment. Normally, it's about 3 months. Sometimes it can be 6 months. It could, in theory, be up to 2 years. Now, I think if Downing Street were being mischievous, they might push it to that. I think that might look a little bit tricky.
Downing Street, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think they have a say in this. It is a COBA that makes the decision, isn't it? I mean, earlier I heard Andrew Marr talking to somebody, and there was a suggestion that the Prime Minister himself could veto it. I'm not sure that's right.
No, it is the independent COBA process that does this, but as I said, you pointed out, it is Lord Pickles who chairs that, and so there will be some element of political.
And he's got a mind of his own. He's not a sort of Tory patsy.
Absolutely not.
But the one thing I would say, also, a COBA's got no teeth. A COBA's got no teeth. How many breaches have there been, and a COBA can do nothing? It's a slap on the wrist.
I'm wondering if Seb and George can actually see that the Conservative Party is making a big fuss about this because they're trying to cover up all the messes that they've made. Do you think there's an element of that at all?
Well, I think some people are, but the point I'm making is I'm here as a government minister in the Conservative Party, and I'm not making that point. I'm just
Well, it means we're not talking about Isabel Oakeshott or Matt Hancock, but that'll could come up a little bit later.
I was just
never know.
Robbie's question,
Well, let's just go back to Robbie, because I think I can tell by the tenor of his question what he thinks. But Robbie, just give your opinion.
Oh, you know me so well, Ian. I'm a big political geek, and I'm one of these weirdos who gets down these rabbit holes, but I think it can be encapsulated in two things that seem to be forgotten in all this. That Sue Gray is a person, apparently of wide repute. I've never had the pleasure, but at the moment, and I know there's parliamentary privilege at play, but it does feel there's almost borderline defamation going on and libel. I know it probably doesn't count in Parliament, but the way her character is being just dragged through the mud, I find personally just utterly shocking. I'm not going to call it misogynistic because I hear she's strong and everything. But the second point is, to something Marina said, it's about the cover-up of all the different things the government perhaps isn't doing quite right at the moment. And George, you're one of my, there's no trophy for this, by the way, but one of my favourite Conservative MPs, because you are very sensible and the sort of Conservative MP I used to vote for, but I can't find myself doing that anymore. Ian, you know why. But we've moved very quickly from, about a year ago, a certain Conservative MP saying we must await the results of the inquiry, to she has trashed the reputation of the civil service as an independent body, and you can
That's
guess
a very
who that
good
is.
impression of Theresa May, if I may say so. Listen, Robbie, we've got to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. We'll come to more of your questions in a moment with our panel. It's 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
Nineteen minutes past 8. George Freeman, Conservative Minister, Baroness Jenny Jones from the Green Party, Sebastian Payne, Director of the Onward think tank, and Marina Purkiss, political commentator and co-host of the podcast The Trawl. They're all with us answering your questions. Just very, very briefly, The Trawl. Now, is that a sort of poor man's version of For the Many that I do with Jackie Smith?
A poor man's version? That sounds derogatory.
It was meant to be.
Well, it's fantastic. We have James O'Brien as a listener. Actually, Gary Lineker is a listener. It's brilliant. It's basically...
You'd rather make my point for me?
You should give it a go. You might learn something.
I have listened to it.
No,
but you do agree an awful lot, the two of you. You do it with Gemma Forte, a good friend of mine, but you do agree a little. I mean, you want to spice it up a little bit.
No. If you want to go somewhere and get, this false equivalence, and you've got plenty of podcasts or news outlets for that, if you want to come to listen to how
Liberal
normal
lefties.
people... how normal people just take in what is going on in this skip fire of a government and observe what's going on in the news and the politics and the bills and the funny clips and bring some levity to it all, that's the Trawl.
It is a good listen. And it's on Global Player. Right, let's go to our next question. It's from Martin in Doncaster. Hello, Martin.
Hello, Ian and panel. Yeah, and the question is it just more sleaze from a party of sleaze if Boris Johnson's dad gets an knighthood?
Marina.
Yes, Martin, unfortunately so. And do you know what the sad thing is? We're so used to this. Why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he? He gave his brother a peerage. He was looking to get his
Well, to
wife.
be fair, his brother was an MP and a quite a long-serving government minister, so you can argue that was okay. But here, I'm guessing the argument is, well, he was an MEP and he's actually quite a renowned environmental campaigner. But even so...
So the idea that he's trying to get back into number 10, right? We think he's trying to get back into number 10. And the loss of his position was all down to the fact that he has absolutely no integrity and he thinks this is the right thing to do. He just debases everything he touches. He has debased the office of Prime Minister, and his peerage list and his honours list makes a complete farce of what is a farcical situation.
Seb, you wrote a book about the downfall of Boris Johnson, which you feel free to plug the title of.
Thank you for mentioning second time on this programme, yes.
Can this be justified in any way? I mean, we should say we don't know that this is happening. This was a report in the Times this morning. Previously, it had been reported he was going to get a peerage, not a knighthood. And that Rachel, also, our esteemed colleague, might be getting a peerage too. I have no idea whether there's anything in that. But, I mean, it smacks of nepotism, doesn't it?
Well, the fact is, all this stuff does actually go through independent panels, properly independent panels, both for peerages, go through something called HOLAC, which is the House of Lords Appointments Commission, and honours go through the Honours Committee as well, based out the Cabinet Office there. And it's up for people on those committees to decide whether the individuals are up to it, whether they're rightful and deserving of it. And I think politicians have to tread a very careful line to make sure they don't put those committees in awkward positions, that they're having to decide on people who may or may not be suitable for peerages or knighthoods. And I think listeners can decide whether they think Stanley Johnson is on the right or wrong side of that. As you said, on the one hand, he was an MEP, I think, for 5 years. He worked in the European Parliament for 17 years. On the other hand, he's obviously clearly the former Prime Minister's father, and I think you would struggle to imagine David Cameron or Tony Blair giving their fathers knighthoods, despite them both contributing quite a lot to civil society. But as to hint at what Marina said, Boris Johnson has operated in a very particular way in politics for quite a long time. This is how he does things. And when he was elected leader of the Conservative Party, people sort of knew what kind of leader they were getting about this. So in that respect, I don't think it should particularly surprise people.
George Freeman, wouldn't this be the strangest appointment since the Roman Emperor made his horse a senator?
It's a colourful metaphor. Not quite. I mean, I think the answer to Martin's question is a good one. Would it be inevitably the ultimate act of sleaze? No, not necessarily. I think the point is there's a due process.
What would be then?
Right. I think the perception is the danger. It's a bit like the conversation we had earlier with Sue Gray. I mean, as you've said, Boris Johnson's father, Stanley, has a pretty distinguished career. He's been a very strong environmental campaigner. The point is, when you're the Prime Minister's father, the Prime Minister has a duty, the former Prime Minister has a duty to uphold standards, and a COBRA and all of those codes are clear. It's the perception of abuse of office is as bad as the actual abuse. So my answer would be to Martin, if the process is forensic, the qualifications are properly scrutinised, and it is proven that it wouldn't undermine public trust, then potentially yes, but I think it's quite a high bar.
So if the various commissions that Seb described there approved this, the Prime Minister has the power of veto. Should he use it? Putting you on the spot in a totally unreasonable way?
It's pretty difficult hypothetically. I think it depends on what the...
All right, if you were Prime Minister...
I just think the difficult reality is the bar is higher. So I could be persuaded, but unfortunately, given that this person is a former Prime Minister's father, the bar is higher because the public fear will be, well, this is nepotism.
Jenny Jones.
Martin, yes, it's sleaze. Of course, it's sleaze. We've got to remember as well that Boris Johnson's father, Stanley, his wife did report that he beat her up. He hit a lot. He in front of the children as well, in front of Boris.
This was reported by Tom Bauer in his biography of Boris Johnson.
That's right. And I just think that recognising somebody who has committed domestic abuse, even if it's years ago, is perhaps not the look.
I think we probably need to use the word alleged here.
Alleged.
Be careful, Jenny.
Yeah, I'm not in the House of Lords anymore. I can't say what I like.
And also, it's a dangerous precedent if you're disqualified because some journalist has written allegations about you.
Well, it was his wife who made the allegations.
Stanley Johnson has never commented on it, or if he has, he certainly hasn't corroborated on it. I mean, why would he, I suppose? And I don't think Boris Johnson ever made any comment about it. But, I mean, if it were true...
Yes.
That would certainly be a reason to scotch it.
There's also the fact that the House of Lords Appointments Committee is an excellent body, but no one had to listen to its advice. And in fact, Boris Johnson didn't listen to their advice when he appointed Baron of Siberia. Yes, exactly. He just happily put the son of of a Russian spy. Am I allowed to say that,
You are.
Ian? Into the House of Lords. Now, we have seen him once or twice, I think, but overall he doesn't come in. I think perhaps he knows nobody really likes him. And so being in the House of Lords, we are expected to work, and most of the people that Boris Johnson put in don't work. And so please don't give appointments, knighthoods and peerages to people who don't value it and don't think it's a job.
Right, let's move on to a very different subject. Martin, thank you for that. Let's go to Chris in Richmond. Chris, hello.
Good evening, panel. Ian, does the panel agree with me that it is immoral to have an asylum or immigration policy which effectively prohibits anyone that comes on a small boat across the channel from claiming asylum?
Jenny?
Yes, of course it is. I mean, no one is illegal. These are people who are almost all fleeing the most appalling conditions. They are hungry, they are tired, they're coming from the most incredibly destructive circumstances, and we should actually set up some legal systems. This is the problem. The government hasn't got any legal routes into the UK.
Well, it has for some countries.
Afghanistan, Hong Kong and Ukraine.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so, for a lot of the people, Syrian refugees, for example, I've worked in Syria, I know exactly the sort of pressure that Syrians are under from the government if they don't completely sign up. We should be setting up legal routes for every single nationality and honouring them, because most of the people who come here...
Every single nationality, or just from a list of countries where we consider that people are in danger? For example, Albania. I mean, there were a lot of people came over the channel from Albania in the last 12 months. I think that has, by and large, stopped now. But no one was suggesting, really, that Albania was a war zone.
The fact is, people flee their countries for all sorts of reasons. Most of them do not want to go to another country, particularly where they don't speak the language. A lot of people coming here have family here, or they do speak the language, and so they see this as somewhere where they could start working. What I would argue is, if we should take every single asylum seeker on their merits, and the government is pandering to the right wing, to the worst bit of their party, the ERG.
You don't want people to come across the channel and risk their lives, do you?
No, of course not. That's why you
what they're trying to do is presumably use this legislation to provide some sort of deterrent to people taking that route.
It's not a deterrent. We've got more people coming across the channel than we did before. It's not a deterrent. The people smugglers make huge amounts of money. The government keeps talking about, we're going to stop the people smugglers. They don't. Legal routes is what will stop the people smugglers.
I think, Ian, you got to in your point there that obviously you've got to have a migration system that does have the right level of compassion, but one that does not allow for the business model to develop that's led to people smuggling in small boats across the channels. And Jenny mentioned that obviously the numbers have increased significantly. I don't think that's actually due to the system. That's due to many other international complicated factors that have allowed to this. I think it is making sure you've got that right balance. I think on the one hand, if you are going to have a tough asylum policy, you do have to reflect that. that by making sure there are due safe routes for that. Because you mentioned, Marina, there are a handful of countries that do have safe routes. There may be an instance, if you are going to be tougher on people who are coming over not through those routes, that you've got some more places for that to happen. But this is a big problem, and it's not one that's going to go away in the near future, because as climate change, the effects start to kick in, there will be more people having to move around the world and will try and flee where they go to. And at the moment, we feel like we've got the worst of all worlds in the UK system, that you've got a kind of detention and deportation policy that's not working, and you don't have that many safe routes. You know, once again, there was someone who was asked about, can you name safe routes? And there's not that many of them. So I think you've got to get the balance.
The Home Secretary couldn't answer that question.
I think there was a couple of people who've been asked about that recently. But I think you've got to have the right balance between those two, and I'm afraid I don't entirely agree with where Jenny was going, just saying potentially allow everyone who wants to come and claim asylum here to do that.
She didn't quite say that.
But it would lead to a
Well,
huge...
they could claim it, but whether or not they're allowed it would be a different matter.
I think, but that, for me, would not fix the problem of this quote-unquote business model that exists at the moment.
Right, we'll hear from Marina and George after the news, but a great text here from Jason in Putney, who says Caligula intended to make his horse a consul, but it never happened because Caligula was assassinated before it could. Given the House of Commons inquiry into the former PM, could there be a metaphorical historical equivalent? Well, I'm glad you added the word metaphorical there, otherwise I wouldn't have been able to read the text out. Thank you, Jason, for that. More of your calls to come, 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 8:31. News time with Daryl Jackson.
The Metropolitan Police says it wishes it could have arrested Wayne Couzens on flashing charges before he went on to murder Sarah Everard. The former officer's been jailed for 19 months for indecent exposure, but he's already serving a whole life term. South Wales Police has referred itself to the independent investigator following the deaths of 3 people in a car crash in Cardiff. The collision happened in the early hours of Saturday morning, but the vehicle wasn't found until today. And Britain's ambassador to the US has told Iain Dale on LBC there is wide-ranging support for the Prime Minister's Brexit deal. In an exclusive interview, Dame Karen Pierce says there's support in the Biden administration and across Congress. LBC weather, spells of rain turning to sleet and snow in places in the south tonight, a low of -5 in northern Scotland.
This is LBC.
With me on the panel, George Freeman, Baroness Jenny Jones, Sebastian Payne and Marina Purkiss. Just before we come to George to answer the question on asylum, let me just tell you, you've got a new podcast out starting today. It's called The Irish Taoiseach. Now, just so you can find it on Global Player, it's Taoiseach, and it's a series of 15 podcasts all about the 15 men who served in the office of Taoiseach of the Republic of Ireland. The first one went live today. Anyone here know who the first one was?
That's Taoiseach.
No, W.T. Cosgrave, followed by Eamon de Valera. Although W.T. Cosgrave was never actually called Taoiseach when he was, if you see what I mean.
What was the position called then?
Head of government. So, anyway, it's on Global Player, The Irish Taoiseach. Now, let's go back to our question from Chris in Richmond. Does the panel agree that it's immoral that the government wants to make it illegal for asylum seekers to come to the UK? Now, before you answer that, George, because you haven't had a lot of coverage for it today, your department, you have made a big announcement today, but it's been rather eclipsed by all the Sue Gray stuff. Do you want to just tell our listeners what it is?
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, the Prime Minister, my Secretary of State, Michelle Donnell, and I today set out the latest in our package of measures to deepen our commitment to science, technology, research and innovation. It's a £380 million package, a mixture of fellowships, PhD students, funding for top labs, laboratories and superfast computing, anticipating that the pace of computing power is not just a sector in itself, but it's actually changing the way we do science, changing the way we do research.
Now, Corey has just informed me that we have a question on science in just a moment, so you may be able to expand on it until then. Anyway, what's your answer to Chris in Richmond?
Well, it's a great question. The truth is the Home Secretary has yet to reveal the full package, and it'll be climbed over rightly in Parliament. And it's very important that we are both sending a signal that we're not going to allow, it's completely unsustainable, and Jenny, I'm surprised you haven't sort of made that point, that 45,000 people last year crossing the Channel. You can't carry on with that, not least because it brings the whole system of asylum processing into disrepute, and so we clearly can't carry on with that. In the end, the proposals have got to tread the fine line between sending a signal that just getting to Dover, getting to the beaches, doesn't entitle you to drift off into Britain and escape into our system. If you're a genuine asylum seeker, you have to know that we'll look after you properly. So we have safe routes for some countries. Personally, I would like us to use much more of our embassies around the world. So you're absolutely right. These are many Albanian men last year. They haven't come here because Albania is dangerous or because they're being tortured. They've come through safe countries. They come through France. So I'd like us to be doing much more to help the genuine vulnerable people who are fleeing Syria and Ukraine and other countries where we know they're really fleeing torture and persecution. And the way to do that, I think, is to have people apply at the Foreign Office in territory. So I've been to the Pakistan embassy years ago in Islamabad. There's a queue every day of people looking for asylum. The local Foreign Office staff know whether they're from a tribe that's being persecuted or not. But in the end...
So why isn't that being done now? It seems an eminently sensible thing to do.
Yeah, well, I'm not a Home Office Minister, but I would hope that'll be in the package. But the last point I would make is that there are 50 million asylum seekers, Jenny, around the world. Even as generous as you are, I don't think you suggest we can have them all here. We're ranked third in the world in the number of asylum seekers we have taken. And it is really key that we have a better way of making clear that people leaving Albania for a better life, who are not fleeing persecution, just know it's not going to work. Don't get to Dover. Don't feed the human traffickers. But we are open and generous to those genuinely fleeing persecution. And the key to this is France, and the Prime Minister and President Macron have a big summit on Friday, and I am hopeful that the PM can deliver the sort of breakthrough on this that he did in Northern Ireland. And in the end, we won't do it without the French working with us.
Okay, Marina.
To answer Chris's question, it is immoral. And you talk about this being a signal to the traffickers, to the people that would come over here to try and claim asylum. It's not a signal to them. It is no impact whatsoever is being had, which is why we're seeing numbers actually continue to rise. There was an interview given by a trafficker to Sky News, and they said it doesn't matter where you're going to ship them to, Rwanda, could be the Amazon. People are still going to try their luck. They are desperate. And this is a signal, let's be honest, to the the bigoted people who want someone to go, right, do you know what, we'll get rid of them. We'll get rid of them. That's what it is, because there is no basis in this. There is no evidence to show that this is going to deter people. And also, it is a soundbite for headlines, because there is no, we couldn't get people off to Rwanda. Not a single person has gone to Rwanda. And here we're talking about detaining every single one of them. Where are we going to detain them? We've got 7 detention centres and they can only cater for a few thousand. We've already got people housed in hotels, which is causing riots. This is a huge problem also because this government and successive Tory governments has failed to get to grips with the backlog. That is what they need to do. Then they need to invest money into National Crime Agency to tackle the traffickers at source and stop with these pointless sound bites.
So we are. Can I just check? You said it's been an ineffective deterrent. Do I take it from that you agree we need a deterrent to prevent those who are not genuine asylum seekers?
I think the only deterrent needs to be, if you get here and we process you and you're illegal, you go. It doesn't need to be everyone that gets here illegally, we just put you on a flight to Rwanda.
Yeah, the difficulty with that is we've been trying that, and there's a whole legal industry of people asserting every right and every claim through the ECHR. So we get tied up in knots, housing people, while the judicial process takes months and months for people that we know haven't got a genuine asylum case.
No, well, that's not. Well, I would say
75% of people are granted asylum, and then of the people that are refused, 50% of those people are then granted.
That's not on last year's numbers. 45,000 people crossed the channel.
It's on 2022 numbers.
Well, they haven't been processed yet.
There are things that we could do to help people who come here.
We have to move on because we've got lots more questions coming in. Let's go to Chris. Thanks for that. Let's go to Robin in Oxford. It's a text question. Rishi Sunak says Britain is going to become a scientific superpower. Think, he said, by 2030. So why haven't we rejoined the EU Horizon scheme yet? Why haven't we, George?
Well, the honest answer to that is we actually negotiated to join Horizon 2 years ago, and the EU, I can understand why, it was unfortunate, basically vetoed that while the Northern Ireland Protocol was difficult. So it was effectively weaponising science for a broader negotiation. The breakthrough in Northern Ireland means that door is now open, and the Prime Minister has signalled that we will now start negotiating with the EU. The reason it's not quite as straightforward as some scientists would like is that in the 2 years that have passed, we've spent quite a lot of money. I launched the Horizon Guarantee Scheme, which funds all those projects that would have received money. We've put 480 million in before Christmas as a Horizon relief package. Today, 380 million. And when you're blocked from being a member of a club for 2 years, it's not appropriate that you, on day one of the third year, have to pay all the membership dues you would have paid in the first year. So there's a conversation.
Is that what they're demanding? Because that's what one of the Sunday papers said, that they want 2 years back membership.
That's the rumour, and we've said, look...
How much would that be?
Well, we would have paid in, it's a 7-year programme, we pay in up front and receive. We would have put in 15 billion, 2 billion a year, 246 over 3 years, and got back about 4.3 over the 3 years. So that's the first answer to your question. That's why it's not quite as straightforward as, great, we're in, because we do actually need to work out what the payment terms are. Secondly, the Prime Minister's made very clear in his answer in the House that the rapprochement over Northern Ireland, which I welcome, I think it's fantastic news, now means we can grip a whole raft of issues in the context of Ukraine, security, small boats, the relationship with Europe. And this, as I say, this Friday he's in Paris with President Macron. I'm confident we'll get to a place where we can sort all this out. But
in theory, you would like to rejoin the Horizon scheme, because there are some who say, well, it's a complete waste of money. What has the Horizon scheme actually ever done for us?
Yeah, so yes, I do, and it's been government policy for the last 2 years that we wanted to associate. I mean, when I started 18 months ago, there was no alternative, and Boris Johnson commissioned me to come up with an alternative if we couldn't get into Horizon.
Didn't we insist on coming out?
No, we negotiated to go in, Jenny.
That's definitely what I remember.
No, Jenny, you're completely wrong. We negotiated...
Oh, I'm completely wrong. Oh, well.
On that, yes, you are.
Yeah,
because
only on that, though.
It was a precondition of mine to support the Brexit deal that we were in Horizon. So we actually signed, we're in Horizon, and the EU said, well, hang on a minute, you're not playing straight on Northern Ireland, so we're going to block you out and block us out.
Well, we didn't play straight on anything. Yes.
Because of time, and I want to get through 2 more questions, yes. I know George has had quite a long time on this, but would you mind restricting yourselves to a minute each on this? Seb, let's come to you.
So we've actually done some work at Onward on what the alternative would be, is if we're not in Horizon. I think the question needs to be, British scientists want certainty. They've had this kind of 3 years of not knowing what's going to happen. Are we going to be in? Are we going to be out? And if we are trying to meet this ambition, and I used to be a computer scientist in another life, and you'll be shocked to hear in that I am something of a nerd, and so I'm...
You do look a bit like one.
Exactly. It's part of the uniform. But I am fundamentally thinking that it's a good ambition to have. What will be right for Horizon is if the finances work, as George was speaking, but overwhelmingly I think British scientists are in favour of this, so the government should try and make it work. But above all, I think we just need to get clarity on this now, so we know where, if we're working in a more independent fashion or with people in Europe.
Marina.
I can't believe that we're just still talking about trying to clean up a teeny tiny bit of the mess that was created as a result of Brexit, and then what? And if we do manage this, and if we do rejoin Horizon to some degree, what? It's another win, like this new Windsor framework. We are just being lied to and gaslit as voters.
I'm not saying George is lying to us.
I think you're dressing something up to be something. If we had not left the European Union and therefore Horizon,
we
wouldn't be having this conversation.
Correct.
Well, of course,
but we are.
Yes, and now if he does manage to do this, how are you going to position it? As a win. That to me is not a win, getting a marginal bit of something we lost.
Well, as you might know, I did vote for Brexit because I thought it would be a better...
You just lost Marina now.
No, because she changed her mind.
No.
And she speaks sense now.
Well, thank you very much. But over the years, I have seen this government mess up every single negotiation. We were horrible to the start. At the very start, we could have allowed EU citizens the right to remain, for example. No.
We did.
No.
We did.
I was there as well.
Yeah, but we did. The fact is, we did.
No, well, that's not how I remember it. I better get back to my...
Your memory, I'm afraid, is a bit faulty tonight, Jen.
Well, they had to apply for indefinite leave to remain, didn't they?
Yeah.
Thank you, Marina.
But that was never. Anyway. That was not supposed to happen.
And everyone that did, as far as I know, was given leave to remain.
The point is, we mangled the whole debate with the EU. We were horrible, and I blame the government.
Yeah, think about Erasmus.
Do you mean Rishi Sunak government, or do you mean the government before? Because we have a new government since October.
Well, the Conservative government might have changed people, but it actually hasn't changed its mindset. And its mindset is, let's keep all these nasty foreigners away. I'm Welsh, actually, and I think I would probably be excluded from your little coterie of people who...
I can't get a British passport right now.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
Because I was born here, but I've only ever had an Italian passport because of my parents, and I've been being stopped since Brexit. I've been stopped at the border when I come home from holiday with, crying baby in tow, and I've been told to apply for a British passport. I did so in December. I've sent them every bit of paperwork going, and they will not give me one.
Speak to your MP. Who's your MP?
Rupa Huck.
She'll sort it out.
Well, on that bombshell, it's 8:48.
LBC
Jenny Jones, Sebastian Payne and Marina Purkiss with us answering your questions. Now, I have tipped them off what the final fun text question is because it requires a bit of preparation. So you'll like it when you hear it, but we're not getting there quite yet. Let's go to James in Hitchin first. Hello, James.
Good evening.
Hi.
In the cold light of Matt Hancock's leaked WhatsApp messages, were the lockdowns a mistake?
Oh, we could be here for an hour on that one. Seb?
No, I don't think so. That obviously whenever we went through the lockdown debate during the pandemic, we had to face what's the alternative to what we were doing at that point. And when we get to the full COVID inquiry, and I think what we've seen with Matt Hancock's message is just a foretaste of what's going to come when we have the full-blown public inquiry, where it'll have Matt Hancock, Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, Simon Case. All these people will have to come up and discuss all this stuff because the inquiry will have all these messages. My view is...
We should say, I think the inquiry had already got these messages, hadn't they?
But they will obviously, when there are public hearings, it will become much more in the debate at that point. But I fundamentally do think what the message has revealed is potentially a lack of challenge for a lot of stuff that you saw between Matt Hancock and some other ministers, a lot of groupthink on this stuff. And when we came to how to approach the pandemic, that could and should have been challenged more. But ultimately with lockdown, I think it would have still come to the same place, because if you look at people who are very sceptical of this, talk about Sweden as the other example, Sweden didn't really have a great pandemic, and the King of Sweden had to apologise for how awfully the government had handled it. But it does show what a fevered policy-making atmosphere it was. I found it with my former Whitehall editor hat on completely fascinating to see how politicians and civil servants are talking, because I never see that. You know, I'm sure George has similar sorts of conversations, maybe a slightly different temperament in his office.
Give us your phone, George. Let me have a look. Jenny?
I think the lockdowns were not a mistake. I think we had to have something to break the cycle. I mean, 2 people in my family at the moment have got COVID. It hasn't gone away. And a colleague of mine has long COVID. I mean, quite ill, in fact. And so it's still something we need to be thinking about. How the decision was made is a completely different matter. And I've got to say, I normally don't have a shred of sympathy for the Conservative government, whoever is in the posts. But on this, I do, because it was the most incredibly difficult decision to make when you're actually closing down the whole of most of society. What they could have done before lockdowns was a better system of test and trace. If they'd had something that followed through on how COVID was developing and so on, and how it was spreading, we might have been in a better place. But unfortunately, I think lockdowns were the best thing to do.
Marina?
Maybe they didn't have enough budget for test and trace. I mean, they only had, 37 billion?
Well, that's true, yeah.
I think they were the right thing to do. I think it's actually ridiculous that this story and this leak is now meaning that we are flirting with the idea that it was the wrong thing to do. Because all it's doing is feeding into the minds of people that were very much anti-lockdown, which Isabel Oakeshott is.
Well, indeed.
Her partner, her whatever he is, Amor, is also. So I think it's a real shame that the narrative has moved that way. As for whether it was done right, I think we're seeing in these WhatsApp messages that actually it could have been done differently. So there was that conversation where actually it should have been 7 days of testing rather than 14 days of isolation. But it sounded like Matt Hancock maybe didn't want to do that because it would look badly on him, reflect badly on him, make it look like he got his policy wrong. And so that's where I question it. But I think lockdown in general should have happened.
George?
Were lockdowns a mistake? No. And we've found something Jenny and Marina and I will agree on. I was in the a COBRA meeting, the first COBRA meeting, when we looked at the data, what was still then called the China virus emergency. And the projection was 400,000 dead. And I remember reading the graph and saying, that means 40,000 people will be dead this summer. And someone said, no, 400,000. And
So you don't know your percentages either, as well as Boris Johnson.
My point was, it was a pretty shocking moment to sit in a government meeting and see the projections.
What was the atmosphere when the penny dropped with everyone on that?
I think, well, interestingly, partly just a whole order of magnitude of OMG, is this for real, or are we being tested? Is this a drill? And then, so I mean, just to say, look, in the end, whatever it was, 200,000 people did die in a global pandemic. It was a tragedy, but there was no doubt in my mind if we hadn't done lockdowns, it would have been a much higher number. But I think it was a very blunt instrument. And once we were sort of on top of it, and in my part of the world, in Norfolk and East Anglia, we used to have isolated outbreaks around housing estates, factories, and the machine was so blunt, it couldn't get on top of locking down one town quickly. It was sort of, well, when the data shows, we'll lock down the whole country. So thought it was blunt. There's no doubt that there were some mistakes made, and the COVID inquiry is key, but I just think it's a shame if we get into tit-for-tat, anti-vax, WhatsApp gate. That is not the way to learn the lessons. There are some serious lessons, and God forbid, we might have another pandemic. So it's really important that we learn the lessons of what worked. The last point I make is, I remember that COBRA meeting, and the view was, we must be guided by the science, absolutely guided by the science, which
they
is
all
right.
looked to you, did they then?
But I think it is also the case that there were always going to be political judgments. And we should have said, scientists advise, we must take their advice, but in the end we take responsibility. Judgments have to be made, and I think there were some difficult judgments about children in schools, and we can't be driven just by pure epidemiology. We have to ask, what is the right thing for a generation of children? So I think there were mistakes made, but the key is that we understand what they were properly through the COVID inquiry.
And just finally, 30 seconds each, Isabel Oakeshott gave these WhatsApp messages to the Telegraph, even though she works for News UK, which I find bizarre in the extreme anyway. She denies that she's been paid for the WhatsApp messages, but doesn't deny that she's been paid for work that she's done with the Telegraph interpreting them. If she approached you to write your memoirs, George, what would your response be to her?
I think well, firstly, I'd like to write my own. And secondly, I think I would want to be doing it with someone I know is going to honour the process. And I just think, she and Matt have whatever relationship they have. I'm more likely to pick up the phone to Seb. Or you, Ian, dare I say.
What about us?
That would not be a good idea.
Maybe, George, you might choose someone who is not diametrically opposed to every single policy you've made when you were in office.
Yes, that would be a good idea.
I'm not so sure. I think it's quite exciting. I'd have her write mine.
Well, we all love reading all of this.
Would you hand all your messages over to her, Jenny? Would you hand all your messages over to her, Jenny?
Well, I'm so boring.
I was thinking about when you sent me a couple of years ago. You wouldn't want that getting out, would you?
What was that?
I'm joking.
Oh.
Right, final fun text question from Gordon in Hampstead. In the light of Matt Hancock's leaked WhatsApp messages, if you could read similar exchanges between any political figure in history and their entourage, whose messages would you choose? Seb?
I would go for the 1936 abdication crisis to see the WhatsApp messages between the then king and his political supporters, including one Winston Churchill, who was in favour of the king's position then, and everyone else within the government, Stanley Baldwin, the Labour Party, Ramsay MacDonald at that point, to watch as they navigated the most perilous constitutional moment that I think we've probably almost ever had in this country.
Excellent response. Marina?
See, I'm a bit more salacious. I'd like to read Berlusconi's and have a look at all the arrangement of those bunga parties. See what went down.
The emojis would be interesting, wouldn't they? Jenny?
I actually chose Winston Churchill as well because my mother's mother always had a huge hatred for him because she said that he started the war. Her brother died at Sebastopol, and she blamed Winston Churchill for that. So I'd love to know if he was really to blame. Perhaps when you're looking at the abdication, Seb, you could look at that as well for me.
For you?
Yeah, if that's okay.
Well, I think Second World War, Churchill, Truman, Stalin, and the feuding generals. I'd love to see, Eisenhower, Allenbrook, Monty, Patton, the messages back to Eisenhower about the competitive race to Berlin. I think it'd be fascinating. And also a reminder that, victories in the end come through defeating a success of failures. And I think that's part of the lesson of the pandemic is how do we make sure next time we don't make the mistakes and get it right?
Well, I would choose Elizabeth I and her various entourages because I think that would be... Imagine you're part of her entourage, you don't want to upset her. I think that might be quite interesting.
Turn on auto-deleting messages.
Yeah, exactly.
Makes sense.
So, to George Freeman, Baroness Jenny Jones, Sebastian Payne and Marina Purkiss, thank you very much. It's been a great cross-question. We'll have another one for you this time tomorrow. Now, coming up in the next hour, we're going to turn our attention to Sue Gray, Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer and Stanley Johnson. I don't know how we're going to meld that together, but the basic question is our former Prime Minister being a tad hypocritical by complaining about Sue Gray when he's said to be giving his own father a knighthood? And why won't Keir Starmer reveal when he started trying to recruit Sue Gray? If you were listening to Nick Ferrari this morning, it was excruciating listening to him prevaricate, not give a straight answer to presumably a very, very simple question. Why did he prevaricate? I don't know the answer to that. 0345